Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking about a sort of transition period. I was about to say transitory. I'm not sure. A period of transition. There we go. That's going to kind of bridge the gap between, traditionally speaking, two different periods of history. So, especially for those of you who have taken an ancient history class, historians typically divide history. You may have heard this lingo before. If not, no big deal. Ancient, medieval, and modern, right? So if you take an ancient history class, uh, you're going to be talking about places like ancient Greece, ancient China, ancient India, and antiquity, or the ancient period, usually runs till about the 6th century AD. And then we have the beginning of the medieval period, which marks a transition in most of these societies. We'll have to talk about geographically specific places to talk about what those transitions look like. But then we have the transition from medieval to modern. And that little segment there is what we're going to be talking about today. And the transition from medieval to modern is largely the result of events that are happening in the 12th and 13th century Asia, specifically as a result of the Mongolian Empire. So we're going to talk a little bit about Chinese history, a little bit about Mongolian history, and how this sort of brings us into the modern period, modernity, 15th, 16th century. All right. So let's start off with talking about China. Now, we've already spent a little bit of time talking about ancient China and the Chinese dynasties, if you remember. China, the geographical region of modern day China, has a continuous history that runs all the way up until about 4000 BC, all the way into the present day. So China as a country, China as a geopolitical region, has kind of existed since civilization has existed, and the people have kind of always identified themselves as being part of one group, right? So this is where we get the timeline of Chinese dynasties, which is a subject in and of itself. But we've talked, at least with me, my students, we've talked very briefly about the Shang dynasty and the transition into what is commonly referred to as the Warring States period of China, the kind of the battle for China, where you have these 7 or 9 different nations that are fighting for this geographical region to see who gets the mandate of heaven. If you have if that's still kind of blurry, you might want to go back and reference that video. A very important time in Chinese history for a lot of reasons, and a major reason is because it gives rise to kind of the traditional schools of Chinese philosophy, of Chinese thought. And the Warring States period ends with the victory of the Qin dynasty. This is also where you get the building of like the Great Wall of China. We're going to skip ahead a little bit, skip ahead a few hundred years to the Song dynasty. Now, of course, those intermediate years are very important, but for our purposes here. So ever since the Qin dynasty, however, China, at least in Asia, both in Northern Asia, Central and Southeast Asia, for that whole period of time, China has always been kind of the dominant power of the region. These Chinese empires will switch hands, of course. They'll go through periods of economic highs and economic lows, but China will remain the big kid on the block, so to speak, for most of its history. And this won't really change until the 12th century, where the Chinese power will be challenged by the Mongolians and eventually overthrown by the Mongolians. But at the beginning of the 12th century, the story is the same, with the Song dynasty of China being the economic powerhouse and the military powerhouse of the region. I want to talk about some brief changes of the Song dynasty for those of you who kind of follow my lectures. one of the things that I tend to emphasize more is intellectual history, especially with Chinese history. With the War and States period, you get the origins of the major Chinese schools of thought, uh, Confucianism, Taoism, and eventually we get the introduction of Buddhism. But the traditional Chinese schools of thought, Taoism and Confucianism, kind of represent the core basis of traditional Chinese philosophy, Eastern philosophy. If you go to college and you take a course on Eastern philosophy, Taoism, Confucianism are going to be some of the first things that you talk about. They are absolutely fundamental to Eastern thought, especially if we're talking about China. So one of the interesting things, the interesting developments that happens in the Song dynasty, getting a little bit ahead of myself here, we have a lot of philosophical transitions, largely because of the economic prosperity of the Song dynasty. Let me talk a little bit about that first. The Song dynasty, in the few hundred years that it exists, was a very prosperous time in Chinese history. I have a short little quote here by the historian Philip Curtin. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that name right. So this is what he has to say about the Song dynasty, and this kind of sums it up nicely for us. Between 960 and 1127, China passed through a phase of economic growth that was unprecedented in early Chinese history, perhaps in world history up until this time. It depended on a combination of commercialization, urbanization, industrialization that led some authorities to compare this period of Chinese history with the development of early modern Europe 6 centuries later. He's referring to the Industrial Revolution. So, three things here: commercialization, China, of course, being one of the grounding anchors of the Silk Road. We'll return to this concept a bit later, but the Silk Road being that ancient trade route which kind of connected east to west. Commercialization, the Song dynasty at its height is making a ton of more money exporting goods, of course, where the Silk Road gets its name from, silk, but also porcelain, pottery, quilts, fabrics. Okay, this is why the comparison is made to the Industrial Revolution in Europe, because there's going to be a massive boom in the Chinese fabric industry. The boom in the fabric industry, of course, when we look to 18th century Europe, is going to provide the basis for the Industrial Revolution in the England area, right? So commercialization, urbanization. Urbanization just refers to people moving to and living in cities. So if we were to do kind of a deep dive into Song history, we would see a spike in the urban population. Why are people moving to cities? Much like continuing with this analogy to the Industrial Revolution, they're moving to cities because that's where the jobs are. That's where the money is. That's where you stand to make the most money as an individual. Urbanization and industrialization kind of have the precursor to the modern day, modern in the sense of 18th century modern, the precursor to the modern day textile industry and textile factories. We'll see a very similar thing happening in China at the time. So all of that kind of summarized to say that this is a very prosperous time in Chinese history, okay? Not just economically. Here we can get into what I was talking about before, but also philosophically, okay? As we've kind of talked about, as I said before, the pillars of Chinese philosophy, Taoism, Confucianism, those get their start in China. Taoism by Lao Tzu, if you've ever read the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu, the author of the Tao Te Ching, a contemporary, at least the Tao Te Ching is is popularized at the same time as the writings of Confucius and his analects, the teachings of Confucius. Taoism and Confucianism are radically different from each other, but at the same time, at least within the Warring States period, at least within kind of ancient Chinese thought, are thought to be kind of complementary, two sides of the same coin. The idea was that when you were growing up, when you were a young person, you would be a good Confucian, because if you remember, Confucianism is very much so rooted in the everyday experience of life. What I mean by that is Confucianism is very much concerned with this idea of piety, of being a good person, what Confucius calls the gentleman, the righteous person, right? And the righteous person is a good citizen, is a good father, is a good mother, is a good child. All of these things kind of combine together. So it's very much so focused on the kind of day-to-day life of the individual, right? And how to be a good person within that context. Whereas Taoism is a bit more abstract, a bit more pie in the sky, philosophical, right? So the idea was that when you were a younger person, when you were a contributing member of society, you'd be a good Confucian, and that when you got older, when you retired, when you had done the business that you'd set out to do, then you could kind of practice Taoism. Well, this kind of balance is sort of disrupted by the impact of Buddhism coming from modern day Nepal, India, entering China at the turn of the century, first century, even before that, right? Buddhism, you could go back and watch the lecture on Buddhism, the introduction to Buddhism. Buddhism is more of, not to get too heavily into this, but one of the best ways I've seen Buddhism described is by Alan Watts, who said that Buddhism is Hinduism stripped for export. Hinduism is very much so well, it originates in India. It's very much so an Indian religion. A lot of Indian ideas and kind of established in Indian culture. Buddhism strips away a lot of the cultural aspects of Hinduism, but keeping the same kind of metaphysical framework, ideas like reincarnation, karma, the sort of cosmological view of Hinduism, but preaching this idea that enlightenment is open to any and everyone. Well, Buddhism, traditional Buddhist thought doesn't really jive well with traditional Confucian thought. I mean, to be clear, there's a lot of overlap there, but the end goal isn't the same. The end goal of Buddhism is enlightenment, personal enlightenment. The end goal of Confucianism is to be a good person, to be a good, in everything that entails, to be a good family member, to be a good member of society. Buddhism, not so much. So I'm ranting a little bit here, but the upshot of all of this is that the reaction that we see in the Song Dynasty is the creation of a new school of Confucian thought as a reaction to Buddhism. So you got traditional Chinese philosophy, Taoism, Confucianism, outside influence. We see the rise of the Buddhist tradition in China by this time, especially in art and music. And the reaction, the conservative reaction to all of this, is the development of Neo-Confucianism. So for those of you who are interested in intellectual history, especially Chinese intellectual history, this is some very important developments that happen here in the 12th century that will stay with the Chinese intellectual tradition all the way up until the 20th century. So if you're interested in Neo-Confucianism, what that means, a lot of great research there, a lot of good authors there. Okay, but I've spent way too much time talking about that. So let's talk about the political situation. So again, the Song dynasty, the economic military powerhouse of the area. You also have several satellite empires that are kind of subservient, that are not really directly challenging the Song, and kind of going along with what the Song says, the Jin and the Shah. Well, let's talk about the Mongols. The Mongols, for most of Chinese history, are kind of this group that have been on the periphery. Up until this point, there wasn't a whole lot of reason for Chinese empires to be concerned with the Mongols. And that's partly because of who the Mongols were, or in their case, who the Mongols are. So let's talk really briefly about this. Who are the Mongols? First and foremost, a couple of distinctions to be made. And if you have been in a couple of my classes and expeditions, you're familiar with this, but I'm going to introduce some terminology here. So first and foremost, the Mongols are a nomadic people. Nomadic meaning that they're hunters and gatherers, right? Nomadic meaning that there are no Mongol cities. They're traveling around from place to place. This is the traditional Mongol dwelling, the gur, I believe it's pronounced. In Turkish, it's the yurt, gur. Mongolian, I think it's the gur. This is very similar to, for those of you who are familiar with North American history, this is very similar to the native tribes of the Plains region of modern day United States. These sort of temporary dwellings that can be taken down and put up relatively easily and are really easy to kind of move around, okay? So the Mongols are nomadic. They move from place to place. They're hunters and gatherers, meaning basically meaning that they're not farmers. They're not agriculturalists. They're not, their society isn't built around farming. What their society is built around is hunting. The Mongols probably more so than other hunter and gatherer tribes. Typically with hunter and gatherer tribes, what we see is a very nice division of labor in terms of gathering food, where women would root for fruits, vegetables, potatoes, yams, foodstuffs that are growing in the vegetation surrounding their camp. And the men would go out and hunt for meat, right? Typically large mammals. We don't really see that here with the Mongols because of the terrain. The Mongols coming from the steppes of Russia, there's not a lot of vegetation that's growing. I mean, there are like wild onions and stuff like that, but there's not going to be vegetation that would be able to sustain large groups of people. So we have a similar division. If you're familiar with hunter and gatherer societies, there's a division of labor, but this division of labor is most of the time somewhat equal, right? Men and women, the goal that they have is the same, is to get food and to survive, right? I like to say that hunting and gathering is a very hand-to-mouth style life. You eat what you find that day, right? So first and foremost, the first thing you want to do when you wake up is to find food. Mongolian society is a little different in the sense that the roles of men and women, men are purely hunting and warfare. We'll get to that here in a second. But the primary purpose, the primary job of the men is to hunt, while the women's job is to kind of do everything else. We have a nice little quote here from a Franciscan monk who visited the Mongols in 1245. And he says, this is an observation that he has, the wives do all the work, while the men make nothing but arrows and practice shooting with bows. Right. So even an outsider was able to see this. So the men would go on these very long hunting expeditions. This is what makes the Mongols different from other hunter and gatherer tribes. The men would go on these very long hunting expeditions, up to 2 or 3 months at a time. And these hunting expeditions were kind of like military practices in which the tribe would get together, they would communicate, they would camp as if they were at war, and they would carry out military techniques in order to hunt their food, techniques that they would also use in battle. Because the Mongols were hunters and gatherers. Yes, they hunted large mammal like deer, also smaller mammal like rabbits and other rodents. But the hunting was also meant to supplement the warfare because the Mongols also had a regular practice of raiding or declaring war on local tribes and or civilizations. Okay. So nomadic hunters and gatherers with a slightly different division of labor that you'll see, for example, in the Americas. This kind of produces a very interesting topic if you'd like to research this further. Mongol women had a really high degree of power compared to other groups. Because like this division says, the focus of the men was primarily hunting and warfare. That's it. Everything else was left up to the women. Of course, this includes child rearing, child education, but it also includes things like trade, political negotiations. The women were also deeply involved in logistics. For a small tribe, that doesn't really mean anything, right? Maybe you have a family, right? Maybe you have 5 to 10 people. Logistics for a group of 5 to 10 people, okay. But the women, for example, Genghis Khan's multiple wives, were still in charge of logistics when Genghis Khan is running all over Asia. So here we're not just talking about one family, here we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. So, and the women, the wives, were in charge of this. They were in charge of organizing everyone, in charge of even organizing the bodyguards and some of the military units that would follow the camps to protect them. So a very high degree of power and independence compared with other cultures. So if you're interested in kind of women in the medieval ages or women in antiquity, this is a very interesting culture and time period to study. Okay, so hopefully that gave you some introductions to who the Mongols are. This will play a very important role in why were so successful in combat. So in the mid 13th, well, the early 13th century, the early 1200s, Temujin, Genghis Khan, as he's later called, sometimes you might see it spelled or pronounced Genghis Khan with a C instead of a G. Genghis Khan unites the various Mongol tribes. The Mongol tribes you have all these different tribes up here in the steppes of Russia. And the reason why they were on the periphery of Chinese society is because, for the most part, they're just kind of up here doing their own thing, going to war with each other. Occasionally, they might invade the Jin territory, ransack a Jin city or farm or something like that. But it's more so a nuisance, if anything, right? They don't really pose a threat until, and this is the genius of Genghis Khan, until they're united under Genghis Khan's rule, that the Mongols present themselves as a united force of hundreds of thousands of men army. Okay. So once the Mongols are united, we start to see Mongol invasion starting in North Asia, starting in the Jin Empire, early on, 1215. Also into Central Asia, modern day Afghanistan region. See that in 1218. Eventually into modern day Korea, the Shah dynasty, the Western Shah dynasty. And by the 1230s, we see Genghis Khan's invasion of the Song dynasty. By the 1230s, Genghis is reaching South Asia, Southeast Asia, and invading the Song dynasty, China. I won't get into all of the military aspects of this. If you're really into military history, there's a lot of fantastic resources on the Mongolian Army and the Mongolian conquest. If you see, for example, Dan Carlin's Hardcore History, he has a whole series of the Mongols, about the Mongols. There's also a great YouTube channel. I'll link it for you. It's called Gods and Generals, I believe. They have a whole series on Genghis Khan's conquest. So by the 1230s, Genghis starts his invasion of China. We also see around the same time the Mongol invasion of the Middle East. This area here, modern day Iran and Iraq, which at the time was under Persian control. So I want to read you a couple of historical references and historians talking about these periods. And this leads to a sort of, not really a debate, but the Mongols, like most nomadic people, are not literate. They have a spoken language. They don't develop a written language until they're united by Genghis Khan. But the Mongols aren't really history writers. A lot of what we hear about the Mongols comes from the people whom they are conquering. And as you can imagine, the people that they're conquering don't have a lot of great things to say about them, right? Why would they? So this leads to a kind of debate, for lack of a better word, between how we view the Mongols. Do we view them as this invading barbarian force that just mercilessly slaughter people? Or in other ways, they're presented as very progressive, like I was saying about the role of women, a very progressive society. Both are true. Historically speaking, both are true. But I want to read you some sources from some non-Mongolian sources about the Mongol conquest that present more of the barbaric aspect of the Mongol invasion. So here we have a Chinese historian talking about the Mongol invasion. The Mongols brought violence and destruction to all aspects of China's civilization. They were insensitive to Chinese cultural values, distrustful of Chinese influences, and inept heads of Chinese government. Right? Completely disrespectful to Chinese tradition and the Chinese people. Here we have a Persian historian. With one stroke, a world which billowed with fertility was laid desolate, and the regions thereof became a desert, the greater part of the living dead, and their skin and bones crumbling dust. Not a very positive picture, right? This is a contemporary Muslim historian who talks about the influence of the Mongolians on Islamic history, right? The one name which Muslims hate and fear the most is that of Genghis Khan, here spelled with a C, Genghis Khan. He is a scepter which has haunted Muslim historians for centuries. He swept like a tornado over the then most powerful and extensive Islamic empire, Persian Empire. In a short span of 5 years, he slaughtered millions of Muslims, forced many others, including women and children, into slavery, and razed to the ground quite a few of the most populous and prosperous cities of the Muslim world. which is true. Okay, Genghis Khan wreaked absolute havoc in the China and the Persian empires. So you kind of have to balance that picture, right? The picture of the Mongolians as bloodthirsty barbarians versus the picture of the Mongolians as this rather progressive nomadic tribe. It's more of a both and type situation rather than an either or. So what made the Mongols so effective? Why was Genghis Khan able to establish the largest land-based empire in human history? I'm not going to be able to do this justice because there are a ton of reasons. Okay. But one of the reasons is kind of hinted at here in this quote by the Chinese historian. Chinese cultural values distrustful, Chinese influences, and inept heads of Chinese government. One of the things that set Genghis Khan apart from his fellow Mongolian generals is that Genghis Khan's army operated off of the basis of a meritocracy rather than the basis of a familial or aristocratic type of operation. I know I just used a lot of jargon there, so let me explain. Genghis Khan promoted people based off of their performance, not based off of their family's wealth or based off of their traditional standing or their ethnicity or their religious beliefs. Genghis Khan didn't care. He didn't care where you were from. He didn't care what tribe you belonged to, how wealthy your family was. All that he cared about was how effective of a leader you were. Okay. So one of the things that made the Mongolian conquest so effective, because you have to think about this. Think about the situation for a second here. The largest land-based empire in human history, extending all the way to the Mediterranean to China. How was Genghis Khan able to keep all of this united in his lifetime? One of the ways he was able to do this, Genghis Khan, he didn't have, this is where the Chinese historian quotes come into play, he didn't have much respect for the people who were already in power. He didn't have respect for the kings who had already established themselves. But who he did have respect for was kind of the lower rung of people, the artisans, the craftsmen, the farmers, the people who were actually productive members of society. Genghis Khan would often spare, whereas the aristocrats of the society, he would most of the time just straight up kill. So the common people, the lower people, although they didn't necessarily like him per se, Genghis Khan did kill a lot of people, right? But there was this sense that they could be integrated into Mongol society without much prejudice or discrimination. Because again, Genghis Khan didn't care. Speaking also to that point, another reason that kept people separated is how the Mongols divided their military. So a couple things to be said about the Mongol army structure. It was based on multiples of 10, right? So it starts with a single soldier. I'm not going to pronounce these Mongol words because I don't know how. Single soldier, 10, 100, 1,000, right? So the group of 10 soldiers would kind of democratically elect one person to be their spokesperson, their leader. I'm not sure what the equivalent of the modern US military would be, but the kind of the group leader, the person in charge. The same would go for the 100, the same would go for the 1,000. When Genghis Khan would conquer a tribe, what he would do is he would take members from that tribe who wanted to join his army. He would gladly let them in, but he would split them up. So let's say that Genghis Khan conquered a tribe, and that 20 members of that tribe wanted to join. Well, he would take 3 members and put them in this group of 1,000, 2 members, put them in that group of 1,000, 5 members, put them in that group of 1,000. He would divide them up into all these places, so that way they were, first and foremost, unable to unite or disband as a whole unit against him. And it also kind of forced them to integrate in with everyone else and to kind of participate in and kind of do what they're told, right? So very effective ways of, very effective logistics, very effective ways to manage these very large armies that Genghis Khan was able to produce. Okay. And again, if you're interested in military history, there's a lot, really a whole lot to be said about that. Impact of the Mongols. Again, not enough time to do all of this justice. But kind of returning to what I said at the beginning, what we see here, the reason why we see a transition from the Middle Ages to the modern period is first and foremost an opening up of trade routes from places all the way to Venice, which is not on this map, Venice, Italy, to China. This opening up of trade routes would make Italian merchants very wealthy, and this is kind of the precursor to the, of course, the Italian Renaissance, these very wealthy, independent Italian city-states that are making their money off of trade. Genghis Khan will do for the medieval world basically what Alexander the Great did for the ancient world, in the sense that during Genghis Khan's rule, there's this kind of legend, the story that's told, that someone could walk from Italy to China with a gold plate on their head, and they would start in Italy and they would still have the gold plate when they reached China. The idea being that it was that travel, trade, the exchanging of goods, the commercialism was extremely safe during this time period. And this is where you get the term the Pax Mongolia, right? Genghis Khan opened up worldwide trade in a way that had not existed before, because he was able to unite all of these different geographical regions and made trade something that was very safe, and, as it always had been, very lucrative. You can make a lot of money off of trading between these different places. The Mongols also introduced new methods of warfare, demographic change. The Mongols, if you want to jump ahead and look at the bubonic plague, for example, the Mongols will also be partly responsible for the spread of the bubonic plague to Europe, different subject for a different day. And also, much like Genghis Khan, much like Alexander, large movement of people across a very ethnically, geographically diverse area will lead to new people entering new lands. Okay, that's all I got for today. If you have any questions, let me know. If not, see you all next time. Bye.